Superwash is one of those words that sounds straightforward until you realize it's carrying a whole suitcase of expectations. If you are a knitter, you've probably seen it on yarn labels. If you're not a knitter but you love wool things, then you've probably seen it on clothing tags as washable or machine washable, and never thought twice about what that actually means. But in the back of our minds, we all know that wool itself, by nature, is not machine washable. And we'll get to that. Either way, that one word, superwash, tends to come with assumptions. Some people hear superwash and think practical, wearable, wool that fits into my real life. Other people hear superwash and think processing, trade-offs. Is this even still wool? And both reactions make sense. It's just that they're focusing on different parts of the story. Hi, my name is Taylor, and today we're talking about superwash wool. What it is, what it isn't, why it exists, what's happening to the fiber, what the research says where we actually have research, and what you can expect whether you're knitting with it, wearing it, washing it, buying it, or just trying to understand it. Now, before we can dive down this rabbit hole at all, we need to begin with what superwash actually means. When we say superwash, we're talking about wool that's been treated to be more resistant to felting and shrinkage in laundering. Sometimes you'll hear shrink-resistant wool. That's just a technical way of saying that this wool is less likely to felt and shrink in the wash. Now, why is this even a problem in the first place? Well, wool has an outer layer called the cuticle, and the cuticle has overlapping scales, kind of like shingles on a roof. These scales are part of why wool is warm and elastic. The scales trap air. They help the fibers recover and contribute to the resiliency of wool fiber. They're part of why wool feels like wool. They're also why wool can felt. Felting is basically what wool does naturally under the right conditions. Add moisture, heat, and agitation, and those scales start grabbing at each other, kind of like Velcro, and they tighten and ratchet into place. And once they lock, they don't politely unlock later just because you changed your mind. Because when wool shrinks, when wool fabric felts, the garment shrinks several times smaller than it originally was. It becomes unwearable, almost armor-like in its thickness and density. In fact, if you ever want to see a felted wool sweater, go to a thrift store, because people don't know what to do with the sweaters once they've washed them, and they end up in a thrift store. And when I see them, I always think to myself that there are very few people that would actually want to wear this garment. However, it could fit somebody and it could absolutely serve a great purpose, but it's a great place to go if you want to see one in real life. And trust me, you'll know it when you see it and feel it. Now, before we get into the controversy and the opinions and the vibes, it helps to understand why shrink-resist treatments even exist historically speaking. Superwash doesn't show up because wool had a midlife crisis. It shows up because the world's rhythm changed. For a long time, caring for wool was just a part of having wool. People owned fewer garments, repaired them more often, and laundry had a slower pace. In that context, special care wasn't an impossible burden. It was just the cost of doing business. Then the deal changes. Washing machines become more common. The pace of life speeds up. Living situations change. More people are living closer together. Apartments, shared laundry rooms, tighter routines. People are busy. The expectation shifts from I will take special care of special things to this needs to survive the system I already have. Because if wool doesn't adapt to how people actually live, people don't stop needing wool socks and sweaters and base layers. They just start looking for something different. This is where synthetics enter the equation, and of course, superwash treatment. That's market pressure. Wearability sells. Predictability sells. And if you want wool to compete in a world where people are used to tossing things into a machine, wool either adapts or it becomes a niche product for people who actively want a slower ritual. And then there's the institutional side, which matters a lot more than people realize. Uniform systems don't run on hand wash only. They need consistent sizing, predictable laundering, and performance at scale. That's not just convenience, that's logistics. If you want a very concrete historical window into this, shrink-proof was already a thing that people were talking about in the early 20th century, and patents filed in 1929 for unshrinkable wool processes. Chlorination-based shrink-resist approaches were already the main processes in use in the 1930s. So Superwash sits at the intersection of wool's natural behavior, washing infrastructure, market expectations, and institutional demand for reliable laundering. It's not just a quirky yarn label. It's a response to the modern world asking wool to behave in a modern system. And this is where I can't resist the line I've been chewing on as I've been working on this script. Wool is basically doing capitalism. Not in a sinister way, in a very adapt or become a boutique museum exhibit kind of way. Because the market is like, we love that you're natural and warm and breathable and cozy, but can you also survive being washed next to a hoodie and 3 dish towels? And wool's like, I hate it here, but yeah. Now, how does wool do that? Superwash is a category, not one single method. But the most widely referenced industrial approach is the chlorine Hercaset shrink resist process. And it's often described as the most popular shrink resist process in all of the research I've done for establishing and producing this video. Here's the layman start to finish version of what's happening to the fiber when it undergoes this process. First, and this is important, this is usually applied before the wool becomes yarn. You're not dunking a finished skein of yarn into something and then out pops superwash yarn. This is happening upstream when the wool is still fiber being processed, often in a clean, uniform form called top. Step 1 is cleaning. Wool starts out with lanolin, dirt, vegetable matter. It was living on the back of a sheep in a pasture somewhere, so you can imagine. It gets scoured so that the fiber surfaces are clean and the next steps are even. Step 2 is alignment. The wool is carded and combed so that it becomes consistent and processable, able to be processed. This matters because industrial finishing is built on consistency. Now we get to the part that makes people squirm. The chlorination process. In simple terms, wool felts because of those cuticle scales I mentioned earlier. The chlorination step kind of buffs out or etches the edges of those scales. It also removes a layer of fatty acid on the surface of the fiber, which is called 18-methylicosanoic acid, or 18-MEA. It's much easier. And this changes the surface chemistry and makes it more compatible for the future layer of a resin. Okay, so here's where I want to insert a mental image that makes this a little bit easier to understand what's going on. If you like artichokes or you steam artichokes, most folks who do this tend to trim the artichokes. Artichokes have little layers of leaves with really sharp pointy ends. You want to trim those so you're not poking yourself while you're eating your artichoke. This kind of trims the artichoke, so to say. I don't know why. I felt like that was really one of the greatest analogies, and I was actually eating artichokes when I thought about it, so just, you can understand. So this is just the part where you file down those pointy bits so they stop trying to permanently bond with themselves in the wash. That's the goal. It's not to erase wool's identity, not to turn it into plastic, just to reduce the grab. After all this is done, the fiber is neutralized so that chemical reaction that goes on stops reacting. That's part of why this process is described as multi-step. Things happen and then they stop happening. Then comes the Hercaset part. A thin polymer resin is applied to the fiber surface. The idea is to create a smoother film so that the fibers slide past one another rather than interlocking and felting. Without the resin, a little bit of interlocking is still possible because even though we dulled the scales, they didn't completely remove them. So the polymer is almost like an insurance. Once that's done, it's cured. Basically set, and that's done using heat. This allows the finish to be durable. Then it's rinsed, dried, and moved on to spinning and yarn production. So the wool is still wool, but the surface behavior has changed, and that is why superwash wool is less likely to felt and shrink. It's also why superwash wool can feel and behave differently when it becomes fabric. And that is where a lot of the controversy starts. Because superwash debates are rarely one debate. It's usually 3 debates stacked on top of each other, and everyone tends to think that they're talking about the same thing. The first is preference and identity. For a lot of people, wool isn't just fiber, it's texture. It's heritage. It's the whole point. They like wool with its full personality. They like the dry grip, that bounce, that I can tell that this came from an animal and the animal had opinions feel. So when Superwash feels smoother and drapier, it kind of feels like this isn't the wool I came here for.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
Sometimes that's not even a complaint. That's just preference. The second debate is environmental concern. People hear chlorine and their brain goes to worst case scenario.
He calls it the dip.
And to be fair, the chlorine Percocet process has been criticized in research because chlorination can generate AOX, or absorbable organic halides, or halogenated compounds in the effluent, which is why alternatives continue to be researched and why this topic stays alive. But online, the conversation can sometimes flatten into treated equals irresponsible, without context of where the processing happens, what standards apply, and what trade-offs alternative methods bring in durability, longevity, consistency, scalability, and cost. Because yes, there are alternatives. Plasma-based methods, enzymatic approaches, different resin systems. The industry has been looking at this for a long time. And a key thing that people forget is a more environmentally friendly method that doesn't hold up in repeat laundering creates its own problem if it shortens garment life. Longevity is part of the impact story too. Now, the third debate is one I find most relatable and one I hear about often. The "it behaved weird and hurt my feelings" category. Someone knits a sweater or buys a wool garment, they wash it, it changes, ribbing relaxes, the drape is different, the length is different, and because wool things cost money and hand knits cost time, surprises are not charming. That lived experience is real. But as it relates to this, here's the most useful point in the entire superwash conversation. Not all superwash behaves the same. A tightly plied, higher twist superwash sock yarn and a soft, lofty superwash sweater yarn, a dense gauge and a loose gauge, a light garment and a heavy garment won't behave the same. So when someone says, superwash always grows, what they often mean is that one yarn in that one fabric in that one care routine surprised me, and I will never forget it. So what should you actually expect in real life, whether you knit or just wear wool? 1. Dimensional change. Some superwash fabrics can relax more after washing. Not automatically, not always, but it can be more likely in heavier garments, looser gauge, and drapier fabrics, because that fiber to fiber grab has been reduced, and so the fabric settles differently when it goes from wet to dry. That resiliency that is taken away a bit when we've removed some of the edges of those scales and that grabbability is going to impact the overall fabric. If you're a knitter, the practical move is simple, and you can already hear it in your mind. I don't necessarily have to say it out loud, but I will. Swatch. Wash your swatch. Dry the swatch the way that you plan on drying the garment. If it's a heavier sweater, do a hang test. Not because you plan on hanging your sweater, but at least this way you can see what gravity will do when the sweater is hanging on your actual body. You don't need a spreadsheet. You just need a small piece of the fabric and a willingness to learn what it's going to do. If you're buying clothing, follow the care label. And also know that machine washable usually means more resistant to felting, not immune to physics. 2. Bounce and memory. This is that resiliency factor. Wool's natural spring is partly about interaction and structure. With some superwash yarns, you may see less snapback or less resiliency, depending on yarn build and fabric structure. Ribbing can relax more. Elbows can bag out more. It doesn't make it bad. It means it's a different tool. If you want structure, you often get better results with a firmer gauge, thoughtful construction, and yarn with a strong twist and more plies. 3. Is pilling. Now, pilling is not a superwash only issue, not even remotely. Pilling is abrasion plus structure. Fiber length, yarn construction, and wear zones of the sweater matter more than a single label. Underarms, bag straps, and cuffs, it rubs there and it will eventually tell on you. And there are ways of handling pilling, and I can link to a video down below where I talk about some different options for removing pills from your sweater. It is not the end of the sweater, it just means there's a little bit more work on your end to maintain your sweater, and you absolutely should. And 4, dye performance, which matters for knitters and for anyone who buys hand-dyed yarn, or for anyone who dyes yarn, like myself. Superwash yarn is a consistent canvas for beautiful color. Saturation, crisp speckles, clear variegation of color. It's part of why hand-dyed yarn looks the way it looks. Even if you personally prefer rustic wool for certain projects like myself, it's easy to understand why dyers and yarn connoisseurs value superwash wool. Okay, speaking of superwash and color, quick side note, because it's directly related, I dye yarn for my hand-dyed yarn business, which is Fiber for the People, or FFTP for short. I've been doing it since 2017, and lately I have been featuring more non-superwash rustic yarns, but I'm also doing something new and I'm really excited about it. I'm now offering pre-knit socks dyed by myself and my husband, and they're on a gorgeous base that's 59% superwash merino, 39% nylon, and 2% elastane. They're machine washable, they feel amazing, and they're lightweight enough to wear with normal everyday shoes. Soft, durable, actually practical. I'm wearing a pair right now. I will show you these ones. Yep. I'm wearing the Fiber for the People socks. Most of the colorways are going to feature a little stripe at the top, which is intentional. Those are there as kind of a nod to the stripe at the top of tube socks, but it's also the way that I dye the socks. I need to have a way to hold the pair together, and that's what is creating that line, and I think it's so cool. I'm getting used to dyeing these. It's a whole new experience, but I love it. Everybody in my family has a pair. My mom has a pair. My friend down the street has a pair. We absolutely love them. They're comfortable, they're lightweight, and they're 59% superwash wool, which is great. You can really feel it in the fabric, but they've got a nice hearty amount of nylon in there, so they're durable and they're gonna stand up. It's gonna be a whole thing. We're gonna be bringing more back to the shop. There are a few pairs left in the shop now, but keep your eyes out because more are coming. All right, back to it. Now the environmental question. There are two big categories of concern here: wastewater and chemical management, and then the microplastics question. As it relates to wastewater and chemical management, wet processing has environmental trade-offs. And because chlorine-based shrink-resist treatments have been criticized for effluent concerns like absorbable organic halides, there's a long history of research aimed at improving or replacing aspects of conventional processes. At the same time, this isn't happening in someone's backyard cauldron situation. In many places, there are regulatory frameworks and standards for chemical and wastewater management, plus voluntary industry programs layered on top of that. In the EU, the registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals, or REACH, is the main regulation designed to protect human health and the environment from risks posed by chemicals. And on the consumer product side, the EU has SafetyGate, a rapid alert system that circulates information about measures taken against dangerous non-food products, including categories like clothing. In the US, the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, has effluent guidelines and standards for textile mills under Title 40 and the Code of Federal Regulations. In China, there are national discharge standards for water pollutants from dyeing and finishing in the textile industry, including discharge limits and monitoring requirements. Then you've got industry frameworks like the Zero Discharge Hazardous Chemicals Program, which publishes wastewater guidelines designed to standardize sampling, testing, and reporting expectations for wastewater in wet textile processing. None of that means no compromises exist. It means the conversation is often about enforcement, transparency, and facility practices, not whether rules exist at all. Now, the microplastics question. In my last video that I did on this superwash treatment process, I didn't dive into the microplastics question, but it was one that came up in the comments, and I want to talk about it right now. When people hear polymer resin coating, the fear is, or the concern is, does superwash wool shed microplastics forever? That's a reasonable question, and it's the kind of question that deserves controlled testing rather than assumption. I found a 2024 paper in a publication called Water, Air, and Soil Pollution, titled Marine Biodegradation Behavior in Wool and Other Textiles. The authors are listed clearly on the research paper, and it's important to note that funding has come from AWI, or Australian Wool Innovation. They ran a simulated marine biodegradation test using natural seawater inoculant. They compared untreated wool with chlorine Hercaset shrink-resist treated wool. And they included synthetics used in similar applications like polyester and nylon. They measured biodegradation using carbon dioxide evolution and examined the residues from that using using very analytical methods that are completely laid out in the paper. Some things that were mentioned was scanning electron microscopy and spectroscopy approaches. Under their testing condition, both types of wool biodegraded readily, and the treated wool biodegraded to a greater extent than the untreated wool, which is really interesting. They discussed possible reasons for this difference, including how the shrink-resist treatment can alter the wool's surface in ways that affect water uptake and microbial access, because a lot of this breakdown that's happening in terms of marine biodegradation is microbial. And so the more access the microbes have to the fiber, the more it can biodegrade. Meanwhile, the synthetic fibers in the study showed virtually no biodegradation under those same conditions, which is, what you would expect. And the part relevant to the resin layer, they report that the analysis of both the solid and the liquid residues showed no evidence that the chlorine Hercocet treated wool generated non-degraded residues under those testing conditions. That's a meaningful data point. It does not mean that every possible superwash treatment process in every possible environment is solved forever. It means that we have real evidence addressing a real concern, and under these conditions, the results were encouraging. Now, if you're watching this as a non-knitter, just someone who really loves wool things, here's the honest situation. Apparel supply chains are long. Wool can be sourced in one place, processed in another, dyed in another, sewn together in another. If you're holding a machine washable wool sweater, you usually won't know the exact superwash method used, and it's not realistic to expect you to trace it all the way back. So what do you do with that? You work with the information you can reasonably access. Care labels, care claims, brand published standards if they exist. If you want to ask customer support one question, keep it simple and keep it short. Is this wool shrink resist treated? And do you follow any third-party chemical management and wastewater standards? If you're a knitter buying yarn, your immediate upstream is the yarn dyer or the yarn company. You can ask what they can reasonably share, who the base supplier is, any yarn sourcing notes they already have and are willing to share with you, care guidance based on their experience with a particular base. If you're an indie dyer buying bases, you're in a better position to ask upstream questions. Where is the yarn milled? Where is the superwash treatment performed, if known? And can they point to any third-party standards and certifications? Now, here's where the everything in moderation outlook actually becomes useful instead of just being a cute catchphrase. This isn't about picking a side. It's about choosing the right tool for the right job. Superwash makes a lot of sense when you want wool that fits into your everyday life and your real life laundering routine. Socks, kids items, gifts for non-knitters, everyday layers. It also makes sense if you love bright hand-dyed colors and sharp speckles with nice, tight, contrasting variegation. Untreated wool makes a lot of sense when you want maximum bounce and memory, when you love wool's natural grip and texture, when you want color work that behaves like it has Velcro superpowers, and when you actually enjoy the slower care ritual. Neither is morally superior. They solve different problems and they come with different compromises. And there's one more layer that really matters no matter which lane you fall in this entire discussion about superwash. And that's use phase. Impact isn't only about how something is made. It's also about how long it stays in use. If superwash allows you to keep a wool garment in rotation for years because it survives your actual laundry routine, that durability matters. If untreated wool gets ruined quickly and replaced, that replacement has a footprint too. So some of the best practical moderation choices are old school. Wash less when things are actually clean. Wash gently when you do, mend when you can, store well, and keep garments in use longer. That's not a purity standard, that's just how people have always taken care of good things. So where does that leave us? Superwash is a label pointing to a goal. Make wool more washable and more resistant to felting and shrinkage. To get there, the fiber surface behavior is altered, and that can come with differences in feel and fabric behavior, plus real processing trade-offs that depend heavily on where and how it's done. But superwash also keeps wool in the wardrobe of folks who may otherwise abandon it. It keeps wool wearable in the world that we actually live in. And untreated wool keeps something else alive too. Texture, tradition, elasticity, that classic wool behavior that some of us love precisely because it asks a little more of us. So the point isn't to pick a team. The point is to understand what you're buying and why, so you can choose intentionally and end up with wool things you can actually use and actually love. Thanks for hanging out with me today. As always, sources for this video are linked down below. In fact, I'm actually linking you over to the Patreon for all folks that head over there, because I am keeping a Milanote board of all of the references that I used to create today's video. So you can find that down below in the description box, as well as in the pinned comment. Thank you guys for hanging with me. Happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye.